Marcus was frantically texting me after seeing my TikTok video from inside the $15,000 luxury charter coach I'd hired to arrive at his wedding, complete with champagne service and a red carpet entrance, while I explained to my 89,000 followers how his family had left their 70-year-old mother with mobility issues standing alone at a Seattle bus stop in a November downpour. But by then, I'd already canceled the $35,000 wedding reception upgrade I'd been secretly funding, frozen the $125,000 house down payment gift I'd promised them, and posted a follow-up video that was trending with Yonner bus stop grandma, showing me enjoying a catered meal in my private coach while his wedding party scrambled to figure out why their venue payments were being declined. Before we dive into how I transformed from abandoned mother to luxury wedding crasher in less than 24 hours, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will completely revolutionize how you think about family respect and the power of strategic consequences when people mistake your love for unlimited tolerance. And while you're clicking that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, because this channel is dedicated to stories that prove something most people never realize. Being 70 doesn't mean being powerless. It means having 7 decades of accumulated wisdom, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from a lifetime of watching entitled people reveal their true character when they think you're too old and dependent to respond effectively. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about this question. Have you ever been abandoned by people who claimed to love you when helping you became inconvenient? Have you ever been treated like a burden by the very people you've spent decades supporting, nurturing, and sacrificing for? Have you ever stood somewhere, whether it's a bus stop, a parking lot, or even a family gathering, wondering how the people you've loved most could simply walk away when your needs conflicted with their schedule? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one, and your experiences matter. This isn't just entertainment. This is a masterclass in recognizing when unconditional love becomes conditional exploitation, and more importantly, how to reclaim your dignity when family members mistake your generosity for guaranteed availability. And if you've never experienced this kind of abandonment personally, stick around, because this story will show you exactly how to spot the warning signs before you find yourself standing in the rain like I did. This story is about the Friday afternoon when I learned that 6 years of funding family milestones, emergency expenses, and dream purchases meant nothing when my mobility limitations became inconvenient for my son's family at a Seattle Metro bus stop. When I discovered that the child I'd raised to value compassion and loyalty had married a woman who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource to be managed around their social schedule and personal convenience. But let me tell you something crucial before we dive into how I went from rain-soaked mother to viral sensation in less than 24 hours. This isn't a story about revenge, though I certainly got satisfaction from watching my son and daughter-in-law panic when they realized what they'd lost. This isn't about being vindictive, though the consequences I delivered were swift and perfectly proportional. This is about understanding that respect isn't optional in family relationships. It's the foundation that determines whether your love and generosity create healthy connections or enable toxic behavior that ultimately destroys everyone's dignity. My name is Margaret Rose Chen, and I'm 70 years old. For the past 8 years, I'd been living independently in a beautiful craftsman home in the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle, just 20 minutes from my son Marcus and his family in the trendy Belltown district. The arrangement had seemed perfect when I'd first moved from my longtime residence in Portland after my husband David's passing. I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 15-year-old Sophia and 12-year-old Nathan, and be part of their lives in whatever way felt natural and meaningful. But before I became the inconvenient mother who could be abandoned at a bus stop when my pace didn't match their urgency, let me tell you about the life I built and the resources I accumulated that would eventually become the foundation of my power to change everything in one strategic weekend. Was born Margaret Rose Liu in 1954, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who arrived in San Francisco during the 1940s with nothing but determination and a work ethic that would eventually allow them to build one of the most successful import businesses on the West Coast. My father, James Liu, had worked 18-hour days learning English and American business practices while operating a small corner market in Chinatown, gradually expanding into wholesale distribution of Asian specialty products. To restaurants throughout Northern California, my mother, Grace, managed our household and the business's accounting with the kind of precision and efficiency that would make a Fortune 500 CFO envious. Our modest 3-room apartment above the market was always filled with the sounds of homework being completed, business being conducted in 3 languages, inventory being counted and recorded, and the kind of conversations that taught us children that success came through education, persistence, and never allowing anyone to diminish your worth based on their assumptions about your background or capabilities. Growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown during the 1960s and 70s taught me lessons that would serve me throughout my life. Though I didn't understand their full value at the time, we lived in a community where respect was earned through character and consistency, where your reputation was built through reliability and integrity rather than what you owned or who you knew, and where family loyalty was demonstrated through actions and sacrifice, not just words and promises. It was also a world where money was carefully managed and respected, where opportunities had to be earned through merit and hard work, and where planning for the future required strategic thinking about education, career choices, and building. The kind of security that couldn't be taken away by other people's decisions, economic changes, or discriminatory practices. My parents had met at a community center English class in 1943. Both recent immigrants who understood that success in America required not just hard work and intelligence, but strategic thinking about how to build respect and opportunity over time in a society that didn't always welcome Chinese families with open arms. They'd married after a careful 5-year courtship spent building their business, learning American customs and legal systems, and establishing themselves as respected members of their community, creating the kind of foundation that could support not just their own dreams, but their children's futures and their community's prosperity. James Liu had arrived in San Francisco in 1941 at age 19, speaking minimal English but possessing an exceptional head for numbers and an intuitive understanding of supply chain logistics that would eventually make him wealthy. He'd started by working in other people's markets and restaurants, learning every aspect of food distribution and retail operations while saving every penny he could manage. By 1946, he'd accumulated enough capital to lease his own small storefront in Chinatown, specializing in traditional Chinese ingredients that were difficult to find in mainstream American markets. "Margaret," my father would say when I complained about having to work in the family store during high school, while my classmates spent their afternoons socializing at soda fountains and movie theaters. "Money that you control through your own effort and intelligence gives you choices that no one can take away from you, but money that you depend on other people to provide can disappear whenever their priorities change, usually when you need it most. Independence is not just about having money. It's about having the skills, knowledge, and character to create your own opportunities, regardless of what other people decide to do." That lesson, that financial independence was the foundation of all other forms of independence, would shape every major decision I made throughout my adult life. It would influence my choice to pursue my MBA even after Marcus was born, my insistence on maintaining my own investment accounts and credit lines even during the years when David's income could have supported our entire family comfortably, and my careful planning for retirement that had allowed me to maintain my dignity and independence even after David's death 8 years ago. Grace Liu had taken evening work as a seamstress for wealthy families in Pacific Heights and Nob Hill, while learning English and observing how successful American families managed their relationships, raised their children, and maintained prosperity across generations. She'd saved every penny she could from her wages, living frugally for the first 5 years while accumulating the capital that would eventually become seed money for expanding the family business beyond simple retail into wholesale distribution and importing. But more importantly, She'd studied the families she worked for, learning the difference between families who maintained their wealth and happiness across generations and those who lost both through poor character, lack of respect for each other, and failure to understand that money without values creates more problems than it solves. Margaret, my mother would tell me as I helped her prepare dinner each evening, watching her hands work efficiently while her mind processed the day's observations and planned the next day's business activities. Money can solve many problems, but it cannot solve the problem of people who don't value each other properly. The families I work for who are truly happy are the ones where everyone treats everyone else with consideration and respect, regardless of who earns the money or who makes the daily decisions. The families who struggle and eventually lose everything are the ones where people take each other for granted and forget that love requires action, not just words, and respect requires consistency, not just convenience. That lesson, that respect, and consideration were the foundation of healthy relationships, would become the standard by which I measured all my important relationships throughout my life. It would guide my expectations for marriage, my approach to raising Marcus, my standards for business partnerships and professional relationships, and eventually, my recognition of when family relationships had become unhealthy enough to require immediate and decisive intervention. By the time I was old enough to understand adult conversations and business negotiations, my parents had achieved a level of financial success that allowed them to focus on their children's education and future opportunities rather than basic survival and daily struggle. Liu Family Imports had become a major supplier to Chinese restaurants throughout the Bay Area, and my father had developed relationships with manufacturers in Hong Kong and Taiwan that gave him exclusive distribution rights for specialty products that commanded premium prices in American markets. But my parents never forgot the lessons they'd learned during those early years of struggle, discrimination, and uncertainty. And they made sure their children understood that security was something that had to be earned and protected through careful planning, consistent effort, and never taking other people's kindness, generosity, or business relationships for granted. The neighborhood where I grew up was filled with families like ours, immigrants and first-generation Americans who understood that opportunity had to be seized through education, hard work, and building the kind of character that made other people want to trust you with responsibility and respect. We learned that success wasn't just about individual achievement, but about lifting up your family and community through your own efforts and integrity, and about creating opportunities for the next generation that would be even greater than what you'd been able to achieve. During high school, while working part-time at Liu Family Imports to help with the business and learn practical skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom, I watched different types of customers interact with my parents and observed how those interactions shaped business relationships and financial outcomes. The customers who were consistently respectful, honest about their needs and limitations, and appreciative of quality service got better prices, priority access to limited inventory, extended payment terms when they faced temporary difficulties, and extra assistance when they needed help solving problems or expanding their own businesses. The customers who were demanding, dismissive, or who acted entitled to special treatment without reciprocal respect found themselves receiving exactly the minimum required service and nothing more. They paid higher prices, waited longer for deliveries, received no flexibility on payment terms, and got no assistance beyond what was absolutely required by their contracts. People respond to how you treat them, my father told me one afternoon, after a particularly rude restaurant owner had stormed out angry about our pricing policies and payment requirements. If you treat people like they don't matter, they'll treat you like you don't matter. If you treat people with respect and appreciation, most of them will give you respect and appreciation in return. But here's the important part, Margaret. You can't control how other people choose to behave, but you can control how you respond to their behavior. And your response teaches them what they can expect from you in future interactions. That observation would prove crucial decades later, when I found myself standing in the rain at a Seattle bus stop, forced to decide how to respond to my own family's decision to treat me like I didn't matter enough to deserve basic consideration. and assistance. I met my husband, David Chen, when I was 26 and working as a financial analyst at a growing technology company in Seattle. I'd earned my MBA from the University of Washington through a combination of academic scholarships, part-time work, and careful financial planning that allowed me to graduate debt-free in 1980. David was 29, a software engineer with dreams of building technology solutions that would help small businesses compete with larger corporations and create opportunities for entrepreneurs who had great ideas but limited access to sophisticated business tools and resources. What attracted me to David wasn't just his intelligence or his professional success, though both were impressive and aligned with my own ambitions for building a meaningful career and financial security. What drew me to him was the way he listened when I talked about my family, my work, and my own dreams for the future. He was genuinely interested in my opinions about things that mattered to both of us, and he treated my goals and career ambitions as equally important to his own when we discussed the kind of life we might build together as partners. Most importantly, he understood that my commitment to maintaining my own career and financial independence wasn't a reflection of distrust in his ability to provide for our family, but rather a reflection of values that had been shaped by my parents' experiences, as immigrants who'd had to build security from nothing in a society that didn't always provide equal opportunities for people who looked like us or came from backgrounds like ours. During our 3-year courtship, David demonstrated the qualities that would make him not just a good husband, but a true partner in building the kind of life that would honor both our family's sacrifices and our own dreams for the future. He was the kind of man who remembered what I'd told him about my family's history and my parents' struggles, and who understood that respect and consideration weren't just nice touches in a relationship. They were fundamental requirements that determined whether love could flourish and grow stronger over time, or would eventually be destroyed by taking each other for granted, and assuming that affection could survive without ongoing effort and attention. When David proposed in May 1983, he did so with a speech that convinced me he understood not just what I wanted from marriage, but why those things were important to me and how they connected to the values that had shaped my character and guided my decisions throughout my young adult life. "Margaret," he had said, holding my hands on the observation deck at Pike Place Market where we'd had our first official date and discovered our shared love of good food, interesting conversations, and planning for the future, "I want to build something with you that our children will be proud to inherit, not just in terms of money or property, but in terms of the values and the love that will be the foundation of everything we create together. I want us to be the kind of couple who still treats each other with kindness and respect when we're 70, not because we have to or because it's expected, but because we've never forgotten that choosing to love someone means choosing to value them every single day, regardless of what challenges life brings us." We married at the Buddhist temple in Seattle's International District in September 1983, in a ceremony that represented everything hopeful about young love, combined with careful planning and realistic expectations. The wedding wasn't elaborate, by today's standards, but it was perfect in the way that matters most. It was a celebration of two people who genuinely understood what they were promising each other and had the character, practical skills, and family support necessary to honor those promises through whatever challenges life might bring. The early years of our marriage had been challenging in the way that builds character rather than destroying it. David's position as a senior software engineer with Microsoft provided a steady and growing income as the company expanded, and personal computers became more common in businesses and homes. My role as a portfolio manager at a Seattle investment firm contributed enough to allow us to save aggressively for the future we were planning, while also providing me with the career satisfaction and financial independence that I'd always considered essential for my personal happiness and sense of security. We lived carefully, but not miserably, spending money on experiences and investments that would build our foundation, rather than on luxuries that would provide temporary pleasure. But no, lasting value. We took modest vacations that expanded our understanding of different cultures and places. We bought a small but well-located home in a neighborhood with good schools and a strong sense of community. Most importantly, we saved and invested systematically, building the kind of financial security that would allow us to weather unexpected challenges and create opportunities for ourselves and our future children that neither of us had enjoyed during our own childhoods. But what made those early years special wasn't the financial discipline or the practical skills we were developing. It was the way we approached every decision as a team, with each person's opinions and preferences given equal weight in creating the life we were building together. We never fell into the trap of assuming that one person's convenience mattered more than the others, or that one person's contributions to our partnership were more valuable than the other's contributions, regardless of who earned more money or who handled which household responsibilities. When Marcus was born in April 1987, David and I were ready for parenthood in all the ways that mattered. We had established ourselves financially through careful planning and consistent effort. We had created a stable home environment in a neighborhood where children could grow up safely while being exposed to diverse perspectives and opportunities. Most importantly, we had developed the kind of partnership that would allow us to raise a child with consistent values and expectations, while also giving him the love, attention, and opportunities he would need to develop his own personality and interests. Marcus thrived in our Seattle home from the very beginning. He was an intelligent child who loved learning and exploring, but who also understood the importance of treating people with kindness and consideration regardless of their background or circumstances. He excelled in school not just academically but socially, making friends easily while maintaining the kind of character that made other parents comment about what a wonderful young man the Chen family had raised and ask for advice about how we'd managed to instill such strong values in our son. During Marcus's childhood and teenage years, David and I built the kind of life that represented everything we'd hoped for when we'd made the commitment to build a family together. David's career flourished as he developed innovative software solutions that helped small businesses succeed in an increasingly competitive and technology-driven marketplace. My investment management career grew as I built a reputation for helping families preserve and grow their wealth through careful planning, strategic decision-making, and understanding of market trends and economic cycles. By the time Marcus graduated from high school, our family's net worth had grown to over $2 million through a combination of David's increasing salary and stock options, my successful investment management, and our consistent saving and investing habits. But more importantly, we had created the kind of stable, loving home environment where Marcus could develop his own personality and interests while being shaped by values that would serve him well throughout his life. Values like treating people with respect regardless of their social status or economic situation, understanding that success required both hard work and consideration for others, and recognizing that family relationships were built on mutual care and appreciation rather than one-sided obligation or expectation. When Marcus graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in marketing and immediately found a good position with a growing Seattle advertising agency, David and I felt like all our careful planning and consistent parenting had been validated. We were proud parents who'd raised a son capable of building on the foundation we'd provided while creating his own version of success and happiness in a world that offered more opportunities than either David or I had enjoyed during our own young adult years. During Marcus's mid-20s, he met Jessica Walsh, a public relations specialist from a prominent Seattle family who owned a successful chain of boutique hotels throughout the Pacific Northwest. Jessica was beautiful, intelligent, articulate, and came from the kind of established Seattle family that could provide Marcus with social and professional connections that would enhance whatever career path he chose to pursue. The Walsh family had been in Seattle for 3 generations, building their hotel business through careful expansion and developing a reputation for luxury service that attracted wealthy tourists and business travelers from around the world. When Marcus brought Jessica home for the first time during Christmas 2019, I was immediately impressed by her confidence, her intelligence, and her apparent genuine affection for my son. She seemed interested in our family history, asked thoughtful questions about our experiences building a life in Seattle, and our approaches to maintaining strong family relationships across generations, and expressed what appeared to be sincere appreciation for the values that had shaped Marcus's character and guided our family decisions throughout his childhood and young adult years. "I can see where Marcus gets his integrity and his consideration for others," Jessica had said during that first dinner, looking directly at David and me with what seemed like genuine respect and gratitude. "You and Mr. Chen have raised someone really special, and I want you to know that I don't take that for granted. Not everyone is lucky enough to find a partner who was raised with such strong values and such a clear understanding of how to treat people with respect and kindness." At the time, I'd treasured that comment as evidence that Jessica understood and valued what David and I had tried to accomplish as parents, and that she recognized the effort and sacrifice that goes into raising a child with strong character and clear values in a world that often rewards selfishness and shortcuts over integrity and hard work. Looking back now, with the wisdom that comes from 4 years of observing Jessica's actual behavior versus her carefully crafted words, I can see that Jessica was already demonstrating the skill she would later use to manipulate family dynamics. The ability to say exactly what people wanted to hear while privately calculating how their relationships and resources could be used to advance her own interests and social status. But during those early years of Marcus and Jessica's relationship, and throughout their engagement and the first years of planning their wedding, Jessica had maintained the facade of being someone who valued family relationships and understood the importance of treating people with consideration and respect. The warning signs had been subtle, and they'd developed gradually enough that they'd been easy to rationalize or overlook, especially when I was so happy to see Marcus in love with someone who seemed to appreciate his best qualities and share his values about building a meaningful life together. David's death 4 years ago had changed everything about my situation and my relationship with Marcus's family in ways that I hadn't fully understood at the time. David had been my partner, my best friend, my strongest advocate in family situations, and my buffer in social interactions where I felt uncertain about family dynamics or social expectations. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep from a stroke at age 73, I lost not just my husband, but also my primary source of emotional support and my strongest voice in family discussions and decisions. The grief had been overwhelming, but Marcus and Jessica had been wonderfully supportive during those first difficult months. They'd helped with funeral arrangements, assisted with legal and financial paperwork, and had included me in family activities in ways that made me feel like I was still part of a loving, connected family unit, even without David's presence and guidance. When I decided to sell our Portland home, the house held too many memories, and maintaining it alone felt overwhelming both emotionally and practically. Marcus had suggested that I consider moving closer to their family rather than staying isolated in a house that was too large and too filled with reminders of my loss. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone during this transition," Marcus had said as we'd discussed my housing options over dinner at their Seattle apartment, with Sophia and Nathan playing video games nearby while Jessica prepared a delicious meal that reminded me of the kind of family dinners David and I used to host. Seattle has some beautiful neighborhoods with gorgeous homes where you could have your own space and independence, but also be close enough to be part of our daily lives in whatever way feels comfortable for everyone. The Wallingford Craftsman house had seemed perfect when Marcus and Jessica had toured it with me. The house was spacious and elegant, with 3 bedrooms, a full gourmet kitchen, a library that could serve as my home office, and a beautiful garden that would give me a peaceful outdoor space for reading and relaxation. The neighborhood was filled with other independent seniors and young families, creating the kind of intergenerational community that felt both safe and socially engaging. Most importantly, the location was only 20 minutes from Marcus and Jessica's Belltown apartment, close enough for regular visits and spontaneous family involvement, but far enough that I wouldn't be interfering with their daily routines, their privacy, or their independence as a young couple planning their future together. But that Friday afternoon at a Seattle bus stop, standing in the pouring rain with my walker while my clothes soaked through and my dignity was shredded by people who claimed to love me, Margaret Rose Chen would finally understand exactly what her relationship with her son's family had become. And more importantly, she would discover exactly what a 70-year-old woman with $3.2 million in assets and a lifetime of strategic thinking was capable of when someone finally pushed her past the point of accommodation and into the realm of consequence and accountability. The woman who'd grown up watching her immigrant parents build respect through consistency and integrity, who'd married a man who treated her as an equal partner for 37 years, and who'd raised a son to value character over convenience, was about to demonstrate that some lines cannot be crossed without swift and decisive consequences, and those consequences would be strategic, proportional, and absolutely unforgettable. Before we continue with Margaret's story and find out exactly how she transformed from abandoned mother to luxury wedding crasher in less than 24 hours, I need you to understand something crucial that most people never recognize until it's too late. How gradually someone you love can stop seeing you as a person deserving of respect and start seeing you as a resource to be managed around their convenience. Because what happened to Margaret at that Seattle bus stop wasn't a sudden moment of cruelty. It was the inevitable result of 4 years of systematic devaluation that had been building since David's death. So slowly that even Margaret herself hadn't fully recognized how dramatically her role in her family had changed. But before I show you exactly how this transformation happened, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and that notification bell is rung, because Margaret's story is about to reveal warning signs that exist in millions of families around the world. These aren't just red flags you should watch for in your own relationships. They're early intervention points where you can stop the progression before it reaches the devastating abandonment that Margaret experienced. The decline had begun so subtly that Margaret initially interpreted it as natural adjustment to new family dynamics following David's death. During those first months of grief, when she was struggling with the overwhelming loneliness of losing her life partner and best friend, she'd been grateful for any inclusion in Marcus and Jessica's lives. When they'd started making plans for her without consulting her preferences first, she'd told herself they were just trying to help her stay connected and involved during a difficult time when she might otherwise isolate herself. When Jessica began rearranging Margaret's living room furniture during visits to make it more comfortable for everyone, Margaret had initially appreciated what seemed like caring attention to her home environment. When Marcus started assuming she'd be available for babysitting Sophia and Nathan without checking her schedule first, she'd felt needed and valued as a grandmother who could contribute meaningfully to her family's daily life. But what Margaret didn't understand during those early months was that grief had made her vulnerable to accepting treatment that she would have questioned and corrected under normal circumstances. The overwhelming sadness of losing David had created a psychological state where any attention from her family felt precious and necessary, even when that attention came with subtle strings attached or unspoken expectations that gradually eroded her autonomy and dignity. David's death had left Margaret not just emotionally vulnerable, but also strategically isolated in family decision-making processes that had previously been balanced by his presence and advocacy. For 37 years, David had been Margaret's partner in every significant family discussion, her supporter when she needed to set boundaries, and her voice of reason when family dynamics became complicated or tense. Without David's presence, Margaret found herself in the position of being the only person advocating for her own needs and preferences in family situations, while Marcus increasingly deferred to Jessica's stronger personality and more assertive approach to family planning. The first major warning sign had come 6 months after David's funeral, when Jessica had announced during a family dinner that she'd booked a weekend getaway for Marcus's birthday and arranged for Margaret to watch. Sophia and Nathan, not asked, announced. The assumption was that Margaret's schedule was automatically available and that her preferences about how to spend her weekend were irrelevant compared to Jessica and Marcus's desire for a romantic celebration. "We thought you'd enjoy having some special time with the grandkids," Jessica had said with the kind of bright smile that made disagreement seem ungrateful and selfish. "And we really need this time together to reconnect after all the stress of the past few months." Margaret had wanted to point out that she'd been dealing with stress too. The stress of grieving her husband, adjusting to widowhood, and learning to navigate family relationships without David's support and partnership. She'd wanted to mention that she'd already made plans for that weekend to visit her friend Helen, who was recovering from surgery and could use some company and assistance. Most importantly, she'd wanted to express that being consulted about family arrangements that involved her time and energy was a basic courtesy that should have been automatic, not optional. But Margaret had also seen how exhausted Marcus looked, how much weight he'd lost during the months of helping her cope with David's death, while managing his own grief and supporting Jessica through wedding planning stress. So she'd canceled her plans with Helen, smiled, and said she'd be happy to help with the children. What Margaret didn't realize was that her accommodation in that moment had established a precedent that would be referenced and expanded in countless future situations. Her willingness to prioritize Marcus and Jessica's needs over her own plans had been interpreted not as a generous one-time gesture during a difficult period, but as evidence that this was simply how family arrangements worked, with Margaret's schedule and preferences being automatically subordinated to whatever Marcus and Jessica decided they needed. The second warning sign had come during Christmas planning that same year. For 37 years, Margaret and David had hosted Christmas dinner in their home, creating elaborate celebrations that honored both their Chinese heritage and their adopted American traditions. It was a cherished family tradition that brought together not just Marcus and his family, but also several close family friends who'd become extended family over the decades. But that December, Jessica had announced that she'd made reservations at an expensive Seattle restaurant for Christmas dinner, explaining that it would be less stressful for everyone than expecting Margaret to cook for a large group while she was still adjusting to life without David. "We don't want you to feel like you have to maintain all the same traditions when they're probably too emotionally difficult right now," Jessica had said with what appeared to be genuine concern and consideration. "This way, you can just relax and enjoy the celebration without all the work and pressure." On the surface, Jessica's suggestion seemed thoughtful and protective. But Margaret had felt a deep sense of loss that went beyond missing David's presence at the dinner table. Hosting Christmas had never been a burden for her. It had been one of her greatest joys and one of the ways she expressed love for her family and friends. The elaborate preparations, the careful menu planning, the decorating and gift wrapping had been meaningful rituals that connected her to her cultural heritage and created precious memories for her grandchildren. Margaret had tried to explain that she actually wanted to host Christmas, that maintaining some cherished traditions would help her feel connected to David's memory and provide continuity for Sophia and Nathan during a year of significant change. But Jessica had already made the restaurant reservations and invited several of the Walsh family members who couldn't easily be uninvited without social awkwardness. "Maybe next year when you're feeling more like yourself again," Jessica had said with the kind of finality that made further discussions seem pushy and unreasonable. Margaret had spent Christmas dinner at an impersonal restaurant, smiling and making conversation while internally mourning not just David's absence, but the loss of a tradition that had given her deep satisfaction and joy for nearly 4 decades. She'd watched Sophia and Nathan pick at unfamiliar food, while they asked why they couldn't have Grandma's special dumplings and Uncle Chen's famous Christmas cookies. Traditions that were disappearing not because they were too difficult to maintain, but because Jessica had decided they weren't worth the effort. That evening, Margaret had realized something that filled her with dread. She was becoming a guest in her own family rather than an integral part of its decision-making and tradition-setting. Her preferences were being treated as suggestions to be considered if convenient, rather than as valid input from someone whose feelings and desires mattered equally to everyone else's. The third warning sign had come during the wedding planning process itself, which had begun in earnest 18 months before the ceremony. Margaret had assumed that as the mother of the groom, she would be included in major decisions about the celebration, particularly since she'd offered to contribute financially to help make Marcus and Jessica's dream wedding possible. But what Margaret discovered was that Jessica's idea of including her in wedding planning meant being informed of decisions that had already been made, rather than being consulted about preferences and options before those decisions were finalized. Jessica would call with updates about venues that had been selected, caterers that had been hired, and guest lists that had been finalized, always framing these announcements as sharing exciting news rather than seeking input or approval. "I wanted to let you know that we've decided on the Fairmont Olympic for the reception," Jessica would say with enthusiasm that made any questions about cost, location, or alternatives seem negative and unsupportive. "The ballroom is absolutely gorgeous, and they have such a reputation for elegant service. We're so excited." Margaret would find herself responding with congratulations and expressions of happiness while privately wondering whether she'd been consulted about any aspect of a celebration that she was apparently expected to help fund. When she'd tentatively asked about the budget or whether there were alternative venues that might be more cost-effective, Jessica had responded with explanations about why the Fairmont was the only acceptable choice for a wedding of this significance and social importance. "We really want this to be a celebration that reflects the importance of our commitment to each other," Jessica had explained with the kind of earnest sincerity that made practical concerns seem petty and unromantic. "And the Walsh family has such a reputation in Seattle society. We need to make sure the wedding reflects the standards that people will expect." Margaret had gradually realized that her role in the wedding planning was to provide financial support for decisions that were being made without her input, while expressing enthusiasm for choices that prioritized Jessica's social aspirations over practical considerations or family preferences. She was being treated as a funding source rather than a family member whose opinions mattered in planning a celebration that was supposedly about joining two families together. The fourth warning sign had come when Margaret had tried to suggest including some elements of Chinese culture in the wedding ceremony, particularly since Sophia and Nathan had always enjoyed learning about their heritage and participating in traditional celebrations. Margaret had thought it might be meaningful to include a tea ceremony or serve some traditional Chinese foods alongside the standard American reception dinner. Jessica's response had been swift and dismissive, though wrapped in language that made Margaret's suggestions seem inappropriate rather than thoughtful. "We really want the wedding to have a classic, timeless feel," Jessica had explained with the kind of patient tone used for explaining things to children who don't understand adult priorities. Adding too many cultural elements might make it feel less elegant and more like a theme party. The rejection had stung not just because it dismissed Margaret's heritage as something decorative rather than meaningful, but because it revealed how Jessica viewed Margaret's contributions to the family. Margaret's background, traditions, and cultural identity were apparently interesting enough for Jessica to mention positively when meeting new people. Marcus's mother has such a fascinating family history, but not important enough to be included in significant family celebrations when they might conflict with Jessica's vision of social sophistication. Marcus had supported Jessica's position, explaining that they wanted their wedding to reflect their own preferences rather than feeling obligated to include traditions that didn't feel authentic to their relationship. But what Margaret heard in his explanation was that her cultural heritage had somehow become external to their family identity, rather than an integral part of who Marcus was and what he might want to pass on to his own children. The fifth warning sign had come during discussions about Margaret's living arrangements and her increasing mobility challenges. At 70, Margaret was still largely independent, but she'd developed some arthritis in her knees that made climbing stairs difficult, and she occasionally used a walker for longer distances or when she was tired. These were normal age-related changes that could be managed with minor accommodations and assistive devices, but they'd become focal points for family discussions about Margaret's limitations and safety concerns. Jessica had begun suggesting that Margaret might be more comfortable in a senior living community where she could have professional support and social activities designed for her age group. These suggestions were always framed as concern for Margaret's well-being and happiness, but they came with an underlying assumption that Margaret's preference for living independently in her own home was somehow unrealistic or unsafe. "We just want to make sure you're getting the social interaction and support you need," Jessica would say during visits that had increasingly become evaluation sessions rather than family time. Living alone can be so isolating, especially as we get older and need more help with daily activities. Margaret had tried to explain that she wasn't isolated. She had close friendships, regular activities, and a supportive community in her Wallingford neighborhood. She'd pointed out that her mobility challenges were minor and easily managed with simple accommodations and assistive devices. Most importantly, she'd emphasized that living independently in her own home was crucial for her sense of autonomy and dignity during a life stage when many other freedoms were naturally diminishing. But Jessica had persisted with suggestions about senior communities, always accompanied by brochures about facilities that offered active lifestyles and maintenance-free living. The message was clear. Margaret's preference for remaining in her own home was being treated as stubborn resistance to sensible planning, rather than as a legitimate choice that deserved support and accommodation. The sixth warning sign had come. When Margaret had offered to contribute to Marcus and Jessica's down payment for their dream house, a generous gift that would allow them to purchase a larger home in a better neighborhood than they could afford on their own. Margaret had presented this as a way to help her son build equity and security while she was still alive to see him benefit from her financial resources. But instead of gratitude and appreciation, Margaret's offer had been met with discussions about financial planning and estate management that focused more on tax implications and legal structures than on acknowledging the extraordinary generosity of the gift. Jessica had immediately begun talking about setting up the transaction in ways that would maximize their financial benefit while minimizing their tax obligations, treating Margaret's gift as an inheritance they were receiving early, rather than as a choice Margaret was making out of love and generosity. "We want to make sure this is structured properly so it doesn't create any tax problems for you," Jessica had said with the kind of professional efficiency that stripped all emotional warmth from what Margaret had intended as a loving gesture. "Our financial advisor has some recommendations about how to handle large gifts like this." Margaret had found herself sitting in meetings with financial advisors and estate planning attorneys, listening to discussions about her own money as if she were absent from the room. The conversations focused on optimizing Marcus and Jessica's financial benefit, rather than acknowledging that Margaret was making a choice to share her resources with people she loved. Her gift was being reframed as smart financial planning, rather than recognized as the extraordinary act of generosity it actually represented. The seventh warning sign had come during family gatherings where Margaret's physical limitations were treated as inconveniences to be managed, rather than needs to be accommodated with consideration and respect. When Margaret needed extra time to navigate stairs or wanted to rest during long outings, these requests were met with sighs, schedule adjustments, and subtle suggestions that perhaps she should have stayed home if she couldn't keep up with the planned activities. "Maybe next time we should choose somewhere more accessible for you," Jessica would say with the kind of forced patience that made Margaret feel like a burden rather than a valued family member whose needs deserved consideration. "We don't want you to feel left out, but we also don't want you to overexert yourself." The suggestions always positioned Margaret's limitations as problems to be solved through her exclusion, rather than challenges to be addressed through family accommodation and planning. Instead of choosing restaurants with easier parking and accessible entrances, or planning shorter outings with rest breaks, the family increasingly made plans that were convenient for Marcus and Jessica while treating Margaret's participation as optional and potentially problematic. Margaret had begun to feel like she was being gradually written out of her own family's life story, not through any dramatic confrontation or explicit rejection, but through a slow process of marginalization that made her needs and preferences increasingly irrelevant to family planning and decision-making. The eighth warning sign had come when Margaret had tried to address her growing concerns directly with Marcus and Jessica, hoping that honest communication about her feelings could restore the mutual respect and consideration that had characterized their relationships during David's lifetime. She'd chosen a quiet moment during a family dinner to express that she sometimes felt like her opinions weren't being valued, and that she'd like to be consulted about family plans before decisions were finalized. Marcus's response had been to apologize for not communicating better, while explaining that he and Jessica were just trying to help Margaret by handling details and logistics that might be stressful for her to manage. The apology addressed the surface issue without acknowledging the deeper problem, that Margaret was being systematically excluded from decisions that affected her life and treated as someone who needed management rather than someone who deserved respect. Jessica's response had been even more problematic. She'd expressed surprise that Margaret felt excluded, explaining that she'd thought Margaret preferred to just enjoy family time without having to worry about planning and coordination. Jessica's interpretation reframed Margaret's concerns as misunderstandings rather than legitimate grievances about being treated dismissively and having her autonomy gradually eroded. "I had no idea you felt that way," Jessica had said with apparent sincerity that made Margaret question whether her perceptions were accurate or whether she was being oversensitive about normal family dynamics. "We've just been trying to make things easier for you during this difficult transition period." The conversation had ended with Margaret feeling like she'd been ungrateful for expressing concerns about treatment that was supposedly intended to help her. Instead of acknowledgement that her feelings were valid and that family dynamics needed adjustment, she'd received explanations about why her perceptions were wrong and reassurances that everyone's intentions were good. The ninth warning sign had come when Margaret had suggested alternative arrangements for family activities that would be more comfortable and accommodating for her mobility limitations. Instead of appreciation for her efforts to find solutions that would work for everyone, her suggestions had been met with explanations about why the original plans couldn't be changed and why Margaret should adjust her expectations rather than expecting the family to adjust their preferences. "The reservation is already made, and it would be really difficult to change everything now," Marcus would say when Margaret suggested restaurants with better parking or venues with fewer stairs. "Maybe you could take an Uber so you don't have to worry about parking. Or we could ask for a table near the entrance so you don't have to walk as far." The suggested accommodations always placed the burden of adjustment on Margaret, rather than acknowledging that family planning should naturally include consideration for everyone's needs and limitations. Margaret was expected to find ways to fit into plans that hadn't been made with her comfort or accessibility in mind, rather than being included in the planning process from the beginning. The 10th and most serious warning sign had come when Margaret had expressed interest in contributing to the wedding planning, not just financially, but also through her time, energy, and expertise. As someone who'd successfully planned large family celebrations for decades, Margaret had valuable experience and creative ideas that could have enhanced the wedding while reducing costs and stress for everyone involved. But when Margaret had offered to handle specific aspects of the wedding planning, flowers, favors, traditional elements that could honor both families' heritage, Jessica had politely declined with explanations about wanting to keep things simple and maintain control over all the details. Margaret's offers to help were treated as additional complications rather than valuable resources that could improve the celebration. "That's so sweet of you to offer," Jessica would say with the kind of patronizing appreciation typically reserved for children who want to help with adult tasks. "But we've got everything under control. You just focus on enjoying being the mother of the groom." Margaret had realized that her role in the wedding was to provide financial support and attend as an honored guest, but not to contribute meaningfully to the planning, decision-making, or execution of the celebration. She was being treated as someone whose function was to fund and approve decisions made by others, rather than as someone whose experience, creativity, and preferences deserved to be included in creating a celebration that was supposedly about joining families together. By the time Margaret found herself standing at that Seattle bus stop in the pouring rain, watching Marcus and Jessica disappear into the crowd without a backward glance, she'd already experienced 4 years of systematic marginalization that had gradually transformed her from valued family member to convenient resource. The abandonment wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment during a stressful day. It was the inevitable result of a relationship dynamic where Margaret's dignity, comfort, and well-being had become negotiable when they conflicted with Marcus, and Jessica's convenience and preferences. What Margaret didn't yet understand was that the woman who'd grown up watching her parents build respect through consistency and integrity, who'd married a man who treated her as an equal partner for 37 years, and who'd raised a son to value character over convenience, possessed the wisdom, resources, and strategic thinking necessary to completely reverse these family dynamics in less than 24 hours. The abandoned mother was about to become a woman who commanded respect, not because she demanded it desperately, but because she finally understood her own worth and refused to accept treatment that didn't reflect that worth. Margaret Chen was about to discover that teaching people how to treat you isn't cruel or vindictive. It's necessary for maintaining relationships where everyone's dignity is protected and valued. But first, she had to reach the breaking point that would finally convince her that accommodation and patience weren't solving the problem. They were enabling it to get worse. And that breaking point was waiting for her at a Seattle Metro bus stop on a rainy Friday afternoon, where she would finally understand that some lines cannot be crossed without immediate and decisive consequences. Before we dive into the specific moment that changed everything for Margaret at that Seattle bus stop, I want you to take a moment to think about something that happens in families all around the world every single day. I want you to consider how many people are sitting in their homes right now, wondering why the family members they've loved, supported, and sacrificed for seem to have forgotten that they're human beings with feelings, dignity, and needs that matter just as much as everyone else's. Drop a comment below if you've ever experienced any of these situations. Have you ever been told you're too sensitive when you've expressed hurt about being excluded from family decisions that affect you? Have you ever had your cultural traditions or personal preferences dismissed as complicated or difficult when they didn't align with someone else's vision? Have you ever offered to help with something important to your family only to be told they have it under control while still expecting your financial support or availability? Have you ever felt like you were being managed and accommodated rather than loved and respected? If any of these situations sound familiar, then you understand exactly what Margaret had been experiencing for 4 years since David's death. And if you've never experienced this kind of systematic marginalization personally, stick around, because understanding Margaret's story might help you recognize these patterns before they develop in your own family relationships, or help you support someone you care about who might be going through something similar. Margaret's story isn't just about one family's dysfunction or one woman's response to being mistreated. It's about something much more universal and important: the difference between being genuinely valued for who you are versus being conveniently used for what you can provide. It's about understanding how respect erosion happens so gradually that both the victim and the perpetrators often don't recognize it until it reaches crisis levels. And most importantly, it's about learning that teaching people how to treat you isn't selfish, vindictive, or unreasonable. It's necessary for maintaining relationships where everyone's dignity is protected and valued. But before Margaret could understand her own power and implement the strategic response that would change everything, she had to reach the absolute breaking point where accommodation and patience were no longer sustainable options. She had to experience a moment of treatment so unacceptable that even someone as naturally accommodating and conflict-avoidant as Margaret could no longer rationalize, excuse, or minimize what was happening to her. That moment came on Friday, November 18, 2024, at 3:47 p.m., at the Metro bus stop on Pine Street in downtown Seattle. But to understand why this particular incident was the final straw after 4 years of accumulated disrespect, you need to understand the context of that entire weekend and how every detail had been planned around Marcus and Jessica's convenience, while treating Margaret's needs and limitations as problems to be managed or ignored. The wedding weekend had been planned with military precision by Jessica, who'd created detailed schedules, transportation arrangements, and logistics that would ensure everything ran smoothly for the important guests and wedding party members. Every detail had been considered and coordinated, except for the details that involved Margaret's comfort, accessibility, and dignity. The weekend was supposed to begin with the rehearsal dinner on Friday evening at an upscale restaurant in Belltown, followed by the ceremony on Saturday afternoon at a historic chapel, and concluding with the reception at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Margaret had been looking forward to this weekend for months, not just because she was excited to see Marcus marry someone who made him happy, but because she'd hoped that the celebration would provide opportunities to rebuild some of the closeness and mutual respect that had been eroding in their family relationships. Margaret had spent considerable time, energy, and money preparing for the weekend. She'd purchased an elegant dress for the rehearsal dinner and a stunning outfit for the wedding ceremony, clothes that would photograph beautifully and reflect her pride in being Marcus's mother. She'd arranged for her hair and makeup to be professionally done, despite the significant expense for someone living on a fixed income. Most importantly, she'd prepared herself emotionally to be gracious, supportive, and positive throughout the weekend, regardless of any small slights or oversights that might occur. What Margaret hadn't prepared for was discovering that Jessica's meticulous planning had included detailed arrangements for every important person except her. Marcus and Jessica had hired a luxury car service to transport the wedding party between venues. Jessica's family had coordinated their own transportation in their personal vehicles. Even the officiant and photographer had been provided with specific parking information and transportation assistance. But somehow, in all of Jessica's careful planning, no one had made arrangements for how Margaret would get from venue to venue throughout the weekend. When Margaret had asked about transportation during a family dinner 2 weeks before the wedding, Jessica had responded with the kind of casual dismissiveness that had become characteristic of their interactions. "Oh, you'll figure something out," Jessica had said with a wave of her hand that suggested this wasn't a significant concern worth detailed discussion. "You're so good at getting around the city. Maybe you could take an Uber or catch a bus. It's really not that complicated." The suggestion that Margaret should navigate Seattle's public transportation system with her walker, formal clothing, and the various gifts and items she'd be carrying throughout the weekend had seemed so unreasonable that Margaret had assumed Jessica was joking. But when she'd pressed for clarification about the actual transportation arrangements, Jessica had become irritated and defensive. "We can't coordinate transportation for everyone, Margaret," Jessica had said with the kind of exasperated tone typically reserved for people who are being unreasonably demanding. "We've got the wedding party and immediate family handled, but everyone else needs to manage their own logistics. That's just how weddings work." Margaret had wanted to point out that as the mother of the groom, she was immediate family, and that coordinating transportation for elderly relatives with mobility limitations was actually a standard consideration in wedding planning. She'd wanted to mention that she'd been contributing financially to this wedding and might reasonably expect some basic consideration in return. Most importantly, she'd wanted to ask why her transportation needs weren't worth the same planning attention that had been devoted to arrangements for the photographer's equipment and the florist's delivery schedule. But Margaret had also seen how stressed Jessica was becoming as the wedding approached, and she decided not to create additional conflict over something she could probably manage on her own. She'd researched bus routes, confirmed that the venues were accessible by public transportation, and planned extra time for travel between locations. She'd told herself that independence was better than being dependent on other people's coordination, and that managing her own transportation would give her more flexibility and control over her schedule. What Margaret hadn't anticipated was how challenging it would be to navigate Seattle's public transportation system during a busy Friday afternoon, while wearing formal clothing, carrying a walker, and managing the stress of trying to arrive at important family events on time and appropriately dressed. The day had started badly when Margaret realized that the dress she'd carefully chosen for the rehearsal dinner was more difficult to manage with her walker than she'd anticipated during the fitting. The elegant fabric and fitted style that looked beautiful in photos were impractical for someone who needed to fold and unfold a walker multiple times throughout the day while navigating crowded buses and busy sidewalks. By the time Margaret had struggled onto the first bus of her journey from Wallingford to downtown Seattle, she was already feeling anxious about arriving late and disheveled at the rehearsal dinner. The bus was crowded with Friday afternoon commuters, and several passengers had been visibly annoyed when Margaret needed extra time to board with her walker and settle into an accessible seat. The first transfer had gone smoothly, but the second bus had been delayed due to downtown traffic, leaving Margaret standing at the Pine Street stop for 25 minutes while November rain began falling steadily. By 3:30 p.m., Margaret was becoming genuinely worried about being late for the rehearsal dinner, which was scheduled to begin at 5 p.m. with cocktails and photos beforehand. When the bus finally arrived, it was packed beyond capacity with Friday evening commuters heading home for the weekend. Margaret had struggled to board while other passengers pushed past her, and she'd had to fold her walker quickly to avoid blocking the aisle, while people complained audibly about the delay caused by elderly passengers who should probably take taxis instead of holding up public transportation. But the real problem had developed when Margaret reached her stop in Belltown and realized that the restaurant was still 6 blocks away through increasingly heavy rain. The sidewalks were crowded, with rush-hour pedestrians who seemed annoyed by Margaret's slower pace and the space her walker occupied. Several people had bumped into her while hurrying past, and one businessman had made a comment about people who can't keep up with city pace that was clearly intended for Margaret to hear. By the time Margaret reached the restaurant district, she was soaked, exhausted, and beginning to panic about arriving at this important family event looking disheveled and unprepared. Her carefully styled hair was flattened by rain, her makeup was running, and her elegant dress was damp and wrinkled from the struggle of managing public transportation in bad weather. But Margaret's real distress wasn't about her appearance or even her physical discomfort. What was breaking her heart was the realization that no one in her family had cared enough to consider how difficult this journey would be for her, or had valued her presence enough to ensure she could arrive at Marcus's rehearsal dinner with the dignity and grace that such an important family milestone deserved. Margaret had ducked into a Starbucks near the restaurant to attempt some emergency repairs to her appearance and collect herself emotionally before joining the family celebration. She'd used the restroom to dry off as much as possible, reapplied her makeup using supplies she'd fortunately thought to bring in her purse, and tried to smooth her hair into something resembling the style she'd started with that morning. While she was attempting these repairs, Margaret had received a text message from Marcus. "Mom, where are you? We're starting photos and need you here." The message contained no acknowledgement that Margaret might be facing challenges getting to the restaurant, no concern about whether she was safe or comfortable, and no recognition that arriving at a family celebration soaked and disheveled might be distressing for someone who'd wanted to look her best for her son's important day. It was simply a demand for her presence with an implicit criticism that she was late and disrupting the planned schedule. Margaret had texted back, "On my way. Had some transportation difficulties but will be there in a few minutes." Marcus's response had been, "Transportation difficulties? You just need to take a bus downtown. How hard could it be?" That response had crystallized something for Margaret that she'd been trying to avoid acknowledging for months. Her son genuinely didn't understand or care about the challenges she faced navigating the world as a 70-year-old woman with mobility limitations. He saw her struggles as inconveniences that reflected poor planning on her part, rather than as predictable difficulties that deserved family support and accommodation. Margaret had managed to pull herself together enough to join the rehearsal dinner, where she'd received polite but distracted greetings from Marcus and Jessica, who were focused on coordinating photos and managing other guests. No one had asked about her journey, or noticed that she looked stressed and disheveled despite her efforts to repair the damage. Her arrival had been noted and incorporated into the scheduled activities without any recognition that she'd overcome significant challenges to be there. During dinner, Margaret had listened to Jessica's family tell stories about their elaborate travel arrangements, their professional transportation coordination, and their careful planning to ensure everyone arrived comfortably and on time. She'd heard detailed discussions about tomorrow's wedding day logistics, including specific transportation arrangements for various family members and wedding party participants. But when Margaret had tentatively asked about arrangements for getting to the ceremony venue the next day, Jessica had responded with the same casual dismissiveness that had characterized her approach to Margaret's needs throughout the planning process. "Same as today, I assume," Jessica had said without looking up from her phone, where she was reviewing the next day's schedule. "The bus system runs regularly on Saturdays, so you shouldn't have any problems." Margaret had wanted to explain that today's journey had actually been quite difficult, and that tomorrow's travel would be even more challenging with the added stress of needing to arrive on time for the ceremony itself. She'd wanted to mention that she'd been contributing financially to this wedding and might reasonably expect some consideration in return. Most importantly, she'd wanted to ask why her comfort and dignity weren't worth the same planning attention that had been devoted to much less important details. But Margaret had also noticed that Jessica's response had generated no reaction from Marcus, who was apparently comfortable with his mother managing her own complex transportation needs, while he and Jessica enjoyed professional coordination and assistance. The message was clear. Margaret's struggles were her own responsibility to solve, regardless of how those struggles might affect her ability to participate fully and comfortably in her son's wedding celebration. Saturday morning had brought even worse weather, with steady rain and wind that would make outdoor travel particularly challenging for someone using a walker. Margaret had spent extra time preparing for the journey, waterproofing her wedding outfit as much as possible, and planning multiple backup routes in case of bus delays or cancellations. The first part of Saturday's journey had gone relatively smoothly, but Margaret had faced the same challenges with crowded buses, impatient passengers, and difficulty managing her walker in wet conditions. By the time she'd reached downtown Seattle for the second leg of her journey to the ceremony venue, she was already feeling stressed and worried about arriving late for her son's wedding. But the real crisis had developed at the Pine Street bus stop, where Margaret had been waiting for the bus that would take her to the final destination. The stop was crowded with Saturday afternoon travelers, and the overhead shelter provided minimal protection from the driving rain that was soaking everyone who couldn't squeeze into the small covered area. Margaret had been standing in the rain for 15 minutes, checking her phone repeatedly to confirm she was at the right stop, and trying to stay as dry as possible while managing her walker on the wet sidewalk. Her wedding outfit was getting increasingly damp despite her protective measures, and she was beginning to worry seriously about arriving at the ceremony looking inappropriate for such an important family event. That's when she'd seen Marcus, Jessica, Sophia, and Nathan walking past the bus stop, clearly heading to a nearby parking garage where they apparently had a car available for transportation to the wedding venue. They were dressed in their wedding attire, looking elegant and prepared, protected by professional quality umbrellas and moving quickly toward comfortable private transportation. Margaret had called out to them, "Marcus, Jessica, over here." Marcus had looked in her direction, and for a moment Margaret had felt relief that her transportation problems might be solved. Her family had a car, there was clearly room for one additional passenger, and surely they would offer to help her get to the wedding venue safely and comfortably. But instead of approaching the bus stop or offering assistance, Marcus had called back, "Mom, we're running late for photos. The bus will be there soon." Jessica had been less diplomatic. "Margaret, we don't have time to figure out your transportation right now. You should have planned better." And then they'd continued walking toward the parking garage, leaving Margaret standing alone at the bus stop in the pouring rain, watching her family disappear into the crowd without offering any assistance or even expressing concern about whether she would make it to the wedding on time. Margaret had stood there for several minutes, rain soaking through her clothes and running down her face, trying to process what had just happened. Her son was getting married in 2 hours. She was his mother, dressed in her finest clothes, struggling with transportation in bad weather while carrying a walker, and trying to maintain some dignity despite increasingly impossible circumstances, and her family's response had been to prioritize their photography schedule over her safety and comfort. To blame her for poor planning rather than acknowledge their failure to provide basic transportation assistance, and to walk away from her without offering help or even expressing concern about her well-being. In that moment, standing alone in the rain at a Seattle bus stop while her family disappeared into the distance, Margaret Rose Chen finally understood, with complete clarity, what her relationship with Marcus and Jessica had become. She wasn't a valued family member whose presence was important and whose comfort mattered. She was a convenient resource when they needed financial support or babysitting services, and an inconvenient obligation when her needs conflicted with their preferences and schedules. The realization was devastating, but it was also liberating. For 4 years, Margaret had been making excuses for behavior that was actually inexcusable. She'd been accommodating treatment that was fundamentally disrespectful because she'd been afraid that requiring better would damage relationships that were apparently already damaged beyond repair. Margaret had spent the next 20 minutes standing in the rain, waiting for a bus that would take her to her son's wedding, where she would smile and play the role of proud mother while internally knowing that her presence was tolerated rather than treasured. Her contributions were expected rather than appreciated, and her dignity was expendable when it conflicted with other people's convenience. But something had shifted during those 20 minutes at the bus stop. Margaret had stopped trying to rationalize or excuse what had happened. She'd stopped telling herself that Marcus and Jessica were just stressed, and that their treatment of her would improve after the wedding was over. Most importantly, she'd stopped believing that unconditional love meant accepting unacceptable treatment without consequences. The woman who'd grown up watching her immigrant parents build respect through consistency and integrity, who'd married a man who treated her as an equal partner for 37 years, and who'd raised a son to value character over convenience, had finally reached the point where protecting her own dignity had become more important than protecting other people from the consequences of treating her badly. Standing there in the rain, Margaret had made a decision that would change not just her relationship with her family, but her relationship with herself and her understanding of what she was capable of when pushed too far. She was going to teach Marcus and Jessica exactly what they'd chosen to walk away from, and she was going to do it in a way that would be impossible to ignore, minimize, or rationalize. But Margaret's response wouldn't be driven by anger, revenge, or wounded pride. It would be driven by the wisdom that comes from 7 decades of understanding how relationships work when both people have dignity and worth, and by the resources and strategic thinking that come from building a successful life through careful planning and sound decision-making. The abandoned mother at the bus stop was about to become a woman who commanded respect, not because she demanded it desperately, but because she understood her own worth and refused to accept treatment that didn't reflect that worth. Margaret Chen was about to discover that the most powerful response to being undervalued is demonstrating exactly what people lose when they choose convenience over consideration, entitlement over appreciation, and their own comfort over their family's dignity. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available for them to take for granted. And that natural consequences are the most effective teachers when people have stopped listening to words. The rain-soaked woman with the walker was about to become the most powerful person at that wedding. And Marcus and Jessica were about to learn that some lessons can only be taught through experience, not through explanation or accommodation. Margaret's transformation was about to begin, and it would surprise everyone, most of all Margaret herself, who was about to discover capabilities and strength she never knew she possessed when someone finally pushed her past the point of accommodation and into the realm of consequence and accountability. That Saturday evening, sitting in the cramped bathroom of a downtown Seattle coffee shop while her wedding clothes dried under the hand dryer and her dignity reassembled itself piece by piece, Margaret Rose Chen pulled out her phone and began what would become the most strategic and transformative 18 hours of her life. But before I tell you exactly what she did and how it completely reversed the power dynamics in her family while creating a viral sensation that would inspire millions of people around the world, I want you to understand that what Margaret executed wasn't driven by anger, revenge, or wounded pride. What you're about to witness was a carefully calculated demonstration of consequences, a masterclass in teaching people that their actions have direct, unavoidable, and proportional results. The first thing Margaret did was research, and she approached it with the same methodical precision she'd used throughout her career as a portfolio manager. For 3 hours that evening, while her wedding outfit hung in her hotel room and her resolve crystallized into action, she explored luxury, transportation services, premium accommodations, and exclusive experiences that most people never even know exist. She discovered that Seattle's high-end transportation companies offered services that would make Marcus and Jessica's wedding day coordination look like amateur hour. But Margaret wasn't just planning a comfortable arrival at her son's wedding. She was designing a visual demonstration of exactly what Marcus and Jessica had taken for granted and what they were about to lose forever. Every element of her plan was carefully chosen to illustrate a specific point about respect, appreciation, and the consequences of treating generous people as expendable resources who could be abandoned when their presence became inconvenient. More importantly, Margaret was about to reveal something that Marcus and Jessica had never fully understood: that their comfortable lifestyle, their financial security, and their ability to plan elaborate weddings had been significantly subsidized by a woman they'd just demonstrated they were willing to abandon in a thunderstorm rather than provide basic transportation assistance. At 9:23 p.m., Margaret called Premier Pacific Transportation, Seattle's most exclusive luxury vehicle service. "This is Margaret Chen," she said, with the confidence that comes from having $3.2 million in assets and the wisdom to use them strategically. "I need to arrange immediate luxury transportation for tomorrow's event, and I'll need several premium services coordinated. Money is absolutely no object, and I need this handled tonight with your most experienced coordinator." Within 90 minutes, Margaret had secured a fully customized luxury coach, complete with professional driver, red carpet service, champagne, and catering, professional photography documentation, and coordinated arrival timing that would ensure maximum visual impact. The total cost for her upgraded transportation experience would be $15,000 for the day, exactly the amount that Marcus and Jessica had budgeted for their honeymoon, and money they would soon discover they no longer had access to. But Margaret's strategy went far beyond just upgrading her own wedding experience. At 11:47 p.m., she called her private banker at Seattle First National and initiated a series of financial moves that would demonstrate exactly how much of Marcus and Jessica's comfortable lifestyle had been dependent on her quiet generosity. She canceled the automatic transfers that had been funding their joint savings account. Contributions of $2,500 per month that Marcus and Jessica had apparently forgotten were coming from Margaret's resources rather than their own income or financial planning. She froze the $125,000 down payment account she'd established for their dream house purchase, money that had allowed them to make an offer on a property in an exclusive neighborhood that they couldn't afford on their combined salaries. She canceled the $35,000 wedding reception upgrade she'd been secretly funding, enhancements that had transformed their celebration from a nice party into the kind of elaborate affair that would be featured in Seattle society magazines. Most significantly, Margaret canceled the life insurance policy she'd been paying on herself with Marcus and Jessica listed as beneficiaries, a $750,000 policy that represented their financial security and inheritance planning. She also sent formal notices to her estate planning attorney requesting complete revision of her will to remove Marcus and Jessica as primary beneficiaries and redirect her assets to charitable organizations focused on elder advocacy, senior, transportation services, and programs supporting elderly individuals who'd been abandoned or mistreated by their families. Margaret also sent a brief, professional email to Marcus and Jessica's wedding coordinator, a service provider who'd been receiving payments from Margaret's accounts without Marcus and Jessica's knowledge. Please note that effective immediately, I'll be discontinuing financial support for the Chen Walsh wedding reception enhancements. Any additional charges beyond the basic package will need to be covered by the couple directly. Please ensure all premium services are canceled and any automatic payments are terminated by noon tomorrow. Thank you for your assistance with these arrangements. But the master stroke of Margaret's strategy was her decision to document and share her experience publicly in a way that would create accountability and demonstrate to the world exactly what kind of people Marcus and Jessica had revealed themselves to be. At 12:33 a.m., she created a TikTok account called Bus Stop Grandma and crafted her first video with the kind of strategic precision that comes from understanding exactly how to make a point that cannot be ignored, dismissed, or rationalized. The video featured footage she'd taken on her phone during the bus stop abandonment, showing herself standing alone in the rain with her walker while elegantly dressed wedding guests hurried past without offering assistance. Her caption would soon go viral and inspire thousands of similar stories. After being abandoned at a Seattle bus stop in the rain by my son and daughter-in-law because helping me get to his wedding would have made them late for photos, I decided to show myself what real family support looks like. Tomorrow, I'm arriving at their wedding in a luxury coach while they discover what happens when you take someone's generosity for granted. Bus Stop Grandma, Wedding Justice, Know Your Worth, Senior Power, Respect Your Elders, Seattle Wedding. What Margaret understood, and what Marcus and Jessica were about to learn in the most public and humiliating way possible, was that in today's social media world, public accountability creates pressure that private conversations never can. Margaret wasn't trying to shame her family into better behavior through social media exposure. She was creating a situation where their treatment of her would become visible to their community, their professional networks, their wedding guests, and potentially millions of people who would judge their character based on how they treated a 70-year-old woman who'd been supporting their lifestyle. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Seattle weather that makes everything seem possible and full of potential. Margaret woke up in her luxury hotel suite for what she'd decided would be the last time she ever accommodated other people's poor treatment of her. She ordered an elaborate room service breakfast, charged it to the credit card that Marcus and Jessica would soon discover was no longer available to them, and began preparing for her transformation from abandoned mother to wedding day sensation. At 10:30 a.m., Margaret received the first indication that her financial moves were being discovered. Her phone buzzed with a frantic text from Marcus. "Mom, our wedding coordinator just called saying there are problems with payments for the reception upgrades. Can you call me immediately?" Margaret looked at the message for several long moments, then turned off her phone and continued with her preparations. She'd spent 4 years responding immediately to Marcus and Jessica's demands for her attention and assistance. Today, they could wait until she was ready to communicate on her own terms. At 11:15 a.m., Margaret's luxury coach arrived at her hotel with the kind of professional coordination that Marcus and Jessica's wedding planning had never provided for her transportation needs. The vehicle was a stunning custom coach with tinted windows, leather seating, full bar service, and entertainment systems that rivaled high-end private jets. The professional driver, Robert, treated Margaret with the kind of respect and consideration that should have been automatic from her own family. "Mrs. Chen, we're honored to provide your transportation today," Robert said as he helped Margaret into the coach with careful attention to her mobility needs and genuine concern for her comfort. "We've coordinated with the venue to ensure your Arrival will be properly documented, and that you'll have red carpet service directly to the ceremony entrance. Would you like champagne service during the journey, or would you prefer to wait until we arrive? Margaret settled into the luxurious seating and accepted a glass of premium champagne, feeling for the first time in years like someone who deserved to be treated with dignity and consideration. Let's begin the champagne service now, Robert. Today is a celebration, and I intend to enjoy every moment of it. As the coach pulled away from the hotel and began the journey to the wedding venue, Margaret started her TikTok documentation of the experience. Her first video from inside the coach would eventually be viewed over 2 million times. Currently, en route to my son's wedding in a luxury coach that I hired for myself after his family abandoned me at a bus stop yesterday. The irony? I've been secretly funding their wedding upgrades for months, but they couldn't provide basic transportation assistance for their 70-year-old mother. Sometimes you have to show people what they've lost. Bus stop grandma. Luxury coach. Wedding drama. Batu, senior power. Meanwhile, Marcus and Jessica were discovering the first of several devastating financial revelations that would transform their wedding day from a celebration into a crisis management exercise. Their credit card had been declined when they'd tried to pay for last-minute venue decorations. When Marcus called the credit card company, he learned that the account had been closed by the primary cardholder, Margaret, effective immediately. Their second shock came when Jessica tried to confirm the reception menu upgrades and discovered that the enhanced catering package had been canceled due to non-payment. The wedding coordinator explained that the account funding the upgrades had been closed overnight, and unless they could provide alternative payment immediately, the reception would revert to the basic package they'd originally booked. The third, and most devastating discovery came when Marcus checked their shared savings account and found that the automatic monthly transfers they'd been receiving had not only stopped, but that a significant portion of their accumulated savings had been withdrawn by the account's primary contributor, Margaret, leaving them with barely enough money to cover their honeymoon expenses. At 1:15 p.m., Margaret's coach arrived at the wedding venue with the kind of dramatic flair that Marcus and Jessica's coordination had never provided for any family member. A red carpet had been laid from the curb to the ceremony entrance. Professional photographers were positioned to document her arrival, and the venue's premium guest services team was waiting to escort her to a VIP seating area that she'd reserved for herself. As Margaret stepped out of the coach, assisted by Robert and wearing an absolutely stunning outfit that she'd purchased that morning during a private shopping experience at Nordstrom, she began filming her arrival for TikTok. Arriving at my son's wedding in style after being abandoned at a bus stop yesterday. Notice the red carpet service, professional photography, and VIP treatment. This is what it looks like when someone values themselves enough to require respect. Bus stop grandma. Red carpet arrival. Wedding justice. Value yourself. The video captured not just Margaret's elegant arrival, but also the shocked faces of wedding guests who were witnessing this unprecedented display of senior empowerment and family accountability. Several guests began filming their own videos, and within hours, bus stop grandma was trending on multiple social media platforms. Margaret proceeded to her VIP seating area, front row, center, with perfect positioning for ceremony photos, while Marcus and Jessica scrambled to address the mounting financial crisis that was threatening to derail their carefully planned celebration. The venue coordinator had informed them that several premium services would be discontinued immediately unless alternative payment could be arranged within the hour. During the ceremony itself, Margaret sat in her reserved VIP seat, looking absolutely radiant and completely composed while Marcus and Jessica exchanged vows with visible stress and distraction. The professional photographers Margaret had hired captured every moment of the ceremony, including shots that clearly showed the contrast between Margaret's serene confidence and the couple's obvious anxiety about their unraveling financial situation. Margaret's TikTok documentation during the ceremony became her most viral content yet. Watching my son get married from my VIP seats after arriving in my luxury coach. Meanwhile, they're discovering what happens when you take someone's financial support for granted while treating them like an inconvenience. The wedding is beautiful, but the lesson is even better. Bus stop grandma. Wedding lessons. Consequences. Senior wisdom. But the real drama began during the reception, when Marcus and Jessica finally understood the full scope of the financial support they'd lost and the public accountability Margaret had created. The reception venue had been forced to implement significant downgrades due to payment failures. The premium bar service had been canceled, the enhanced menu had been reduced to basic options, and the live band had been replaced with a DJ playing from a basic sound system. Meanwhile, Margaret was hosting her own VIP reception experience in a private dining room she'd reserved adjacent to the main reception hall. She'd arranged for premium catering, professional entertainment, and luxury amenities that showcased exactly what Marcus and Jessica had walked away from when they'd chosen to abandon her at that bus stop. Margaret's TikTok video from her VIP reception became a masterclass in strategic consequence delivery. Hosting my own VIP reception while my son's wedding reception struggles with basic service after losing my financial support. This is what happens when you mistake someone's generosity for guaranteed availability. The lesson: treat people well while you have access to them, because you might not get a second chance. Bus stop grandma, jock VIP treatment. Natural consequences. Senior power. At 6:47 p.m., Marcus finally approached Margaret's VIP area, having spent most of his wedding day dealing with financial crises and venue coordination problems. He looked exhausted, stressed, and humbled in a way that Margaret had never seen before. For the first time in 4 years, he was approaching her as someone who needed something rather than someone who was entitled to her support. "Mom," Marcus began, but Margaret interrupted with the professional authority that came from finally understanding her own power and worth. "Marcus," she said, consulting her phone with deliberate formality while her personal videographer continued documenting the interaction. "I'm currently enjoying my VIP reception experience after arriving at your wedding in luxury transportation that I arranged for myself. I understand you've had some challenges today with financial arrangements that you'd apparently assumed would continue regardless of how you treated the person providing them." For the next 30 minutes, Margaret calmly and methodically explained 4 years of systematic marginalization, taking advantage of her generosity, and increasing disrespect, culminating in the bus stop abandonment that had finally convinced her that Marcus and Jessica valued her resources more than they respected her person. She explained how her attempts to address these issues through normal family communication had been dismissed, minimized, and ignored. Most importantly, she described how she'd finally understood that continuing to provide financial support to people who treated her disrespectfully was actually enabling their harmful behavior rather than encouraging them to change it. Marcus and Jessica listened in stunned silence as Margaret presented documentation of the financial support that had been quietly funding their lifestyle. The monthly savings account contributions, the house down payment fund, the wedding reception upgrades, the life insurance policy, and dozens of smaller contributions for family activities, emergency expenses, and luxury purchases that they'd taken for granted. "The total value of my financial contributions to your family," Margaret explained with devastating precision, "has been approximately $156,000 per year for the past 4 years. This doesn't include the larger gifts like the house down payment fund, the wedding upgrades, or the life insurance policy I'd been maintaining with you as beneficiaries." The numbers created a silence that stretched for several minutes as Marcus and Jessica confronted the reality of how dependent their comfortable lifestyle had become on Margaret's extraordinary generosity they'd been taking for granted, while treating her with increasing disrespect and inconsideration. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," Margaret said when the silence became uncomfortable enough to demand a response. This was never about money, and it's still not about money. You're both intelligent, capable adults who can build a good life without my financial support if you choose to do so. This is about respect, consideration, and basic human dignity. This is about recognizing that relationships require mutual care and consideration, even when one person is in a position to be more financially generous than the other. Jessica spoke for the first time since approaching Margaret's VIP area, her voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine shock and remorse. Margaret, we had no idea you were contributing this much to our lives. We thought you were just helping out occasionally when we asked, not subsidizing our entire lifestyle. No, Margaret replied with the kind of gentle firmness that comes from finally speaking truth without worrying about other people's comfort or feelings. You knew exactly how much I was contributing, Jessica. You chose not to think about it because thinking about it would have required acknowledging that your treatment of me was unacceptable and unsustainable. It would have required recognizing that I was a person deserving of consideration rather than just a resource to be managed around your convenience. Marcus tried to defend their behavior, his voice containing the desperation of someone who was finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd lost. Mom, we never meant to take advantage of you. We just got busy with wedding planning and work stress, and maybe we didn't express our appreciation as clearly as we should have. But abandoning you at the bus stop? That was just poor timing and wedding day pressure. Marcus, Margaret said, looking directly at the son she'd raised to value character over convenience. You didn't abandon me because of poor timing or wedding pressure. You abandoned me because helping me with transportation in the rain was less convenient than arriving early for your photography session. When I tried to get your attention and ask for help, you told me to plan better and take the bus. That wasn't poor communication. That was a complete lack of respect for my dignity, well-being, and worth as a human being. Margaret then presented the terms under which she might consider restoring some level of family relationship, though she emphasized that these terms would require sustained demonstration of changed behavior rather than just promises or temporary improvements. The terms were simple but non-negotiable. Marcus and Jessica would need to demonstrate through their actions, not just their words, that they understood Margaret's worth as a person, rather than just her utility as a financial resource. This would require scheduled, regular family time where Margaret's preferences, comfort, and enjoyment were prioritized equally with everyone else's needs and wants. It would require genuine consultation about plans that affected her, rather than assumptions about her availability based on their convenience. Most importantly, it would require ongoing acknowledgement that Margaret's contributions were choices she was making out of love and generosity, not obligations she owed them or services they were entitled to receive. I'm willing to consider gradually rebuilding our family relationship, Margaret explained with the precision of someone who'd spent decades managing complex financial and personal arrangements, but only if I see consistent evidence over a period of at least 1 year that your family's treatment of me has fundamentally and permanently changed. This isn't about perfect behavior or walking on eggshells. It's about basic respect, consideration, and appreciation for someone who's choosing to be extraordinarily generous with her time and resources. Margaret also announced that she'd be taking an extended vacation to explore options for relocating to a community where her independence would be celebrated rather than managed, and where her cultural heritage and personal preferences would be valued rather than dismissed as inconvenient. Complications. She'd booked a luxury tour of senior communities in California, Arizona, and Hawaii, where she would explore living arrangements that prioritize dignity, respect, and genuine community over proximity to family members who demonstrated they didn't value her properly. I've spent 4 years trying to maintain family relationships that required me to accept unacceptable treatment, Margaret announced to her growing TikTok audience in a video that would eventually be viewed over 5 million times. I've finally learned that my worth isn't determined by other people's appreciation, and my happiness isn't dependent on their approval. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling people's poor behavior by continuing to provide benefits, regardless of how they treat you. The conversation ended with Marcus and Jessica understanding that their relationship with Margaret would never return to the previous arrangement where they could take her generosity for granted while providing minimal consideration in return. If they wanted to rebuild any kind of relationship with Margaret, they would first need to demonstrate that they valued her as a person rather than just as a source of financial support and convenient services. Over the following months, Marcus and Jessica had to learn fundamental lessons about respect, appreciation, and the difference between love and exploitation. Marcus had to confront the reality that he'd allowed his marriage to change his relationship with his mother in ways that were harmful and unsustainable. He had to acknowledge that his mother's feelings and needs were just as important as Jessica's preferences, and that family relationships required active effort and consideration, not just assumptions and expectations. Jessica's transformation was more dramatic and challenging. She had to recognize that her approach to family relationships had been guided by social status concerns and convenience rather than genuine care and respect. She had to learn that appreciating someone's contributions meant considering their feelings and needs, not just benefiting from their generosity while providing minimal reciprocity. Most importantly, both Marcus and Jessica had to accept that Margaret's previous accommodations, financial contributions, and availability had been gifts freely given out of love and generosity, not obligations she owed them or services they were entitled to receive. And gifts can be withdrawn when the recipients demonstrate they don't value the gift giver enough to treat them with basic respect and consideration. Margaret's TikTok account, Bus Stop Grandma, continued to inspire millions of people around the world who were dealing with similar family dynamics and relationship challenges. Her videos about setting boundaries, requiring respect, understanding your own worth, and refusing to accept mistreatment resonated with people of all ages who'd been struggling with exploitative relationships but didn't know how to change the dynamics without losing the relationships entirely. But more importantly, Margaret had discovered something about herself that changed how she approached every relationship in her life going forward. That teaching people how to treat you isn't cruel, selfish, or unreasonable. It's necessary for maintaining relationships where everyone's dignity is respected and protected. That requiring appreciation and consideration doesn't damage good relationships. It preserves them and helps them flourish. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are taking you for granted is to stop being available, for them to take for granted until they learn to value what they've been receiving. Margaret's story became a powerful reminder that age isn't a limitation. It's an accumulation of wisdom, resources, life experience, and the kind of strategic thinking that only comes from decades of understanding exactly how relationships are supposed to work when both people have dignity and worth. Her response to being abandoned demonstrated that seniors don't have to accept mistreatment just because it's coming from family members, and that having financial resources means having options when options become necessary for protecting your self-respect. 6 months after the bus stop transformation, Margaret had relocated to a beautiful senior community in San Diego, where she was surrounded by people who valued her wisdom, appreciated her cultural heritage, and treated her independence as something to be celebrated rather than managed. She'd found genuine community with people who understood that aging was a privilege that came with earned wisdom, accumulated resources, and the freedom to choose relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Marcus and Jessica had spent those 6 months learning to function without Margaret's financial subsidies, while working to rebuild their relationship with her based on genuine respect and appreciation, rather than convenience and expectation. The process had been difficult, but ultimately transformative, teaching them lessons about family dynamics, gratitude, and the importance of treating people well while you have access to them. Margaret's European river cruise, the one she'd planned, for herself using the money originally intended for Marcus and Jessica's honeymoon, had been featured in several travel magazines as an example of how senior travel could be both luxurious and empowering. Her TikTok documentation of the experience had inspired thousands of older adults to invest in their own happiness and comfort rather than sacrificing for family members who didn't appreciate their generosity. The wedding coach had become a symbol of Margaret's transformation from someone who hoped for respect to someone who required it. The luxury vehicle service had featured her story in their marketing materials as an example of how transportation could be about dignity and empowerment rather than just getting from one place to another. But the most important transformation had been Margaret's understanding of her own worth and her refusal to accept treatment that didn't reflect that worth. She'd learned that dignity wasn't negotiable, regardless of her age, her family situation, or how much she loved the people who were mistreating her. She'd discovered that respect wasn't something you earn through increasingly desperate acts of service and accommodation. It was something you require as the foundation for allowing people access to your time, energy, and resources. Margaret's story became a reminder that real power isn't about making people afraid of you. It's about understanding your own worth and refusing to accept treatment that doesn't reflect that worth. Her transformation from abandoned mother to empowered woman proved that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, command the respect you deserve, and show the world exactly what you're capable of when someone finally pushes you too far. The woman who'd been left at a bus stop had become someone who traveled in luxury coaches, not because she needed expensive transportation, but because she'd finally understood that she deserved to be treated with the consideration and respect that should have been automatic from the people who claimed to love her. Margaret Rose Chen's story proved that the most magical transformation of all is finally deciding that your worth isn't negotiable, your dignity isn't optional, and your happiness isn't dependent on other people's approval or appreciation. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone, including yourself, is the natural consequence of their own behavior. If you've made it this far in Margaret's story, remember this: you have more power than you realize to change the dynamics in your own relationships, regardless of your age, financial situation, or family circumstances. You don't have to accept disrespect from people just because you love them. You don't have to continue providing benefits to people who don't appreciate the person providing them. And you definitely don't have to sacrifice your dignity to maintain relationships that aren't based on mutual respect and consideration. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because Margaret's story is just one example of what happens when people stop accepting unacceptable behavior and start requiring the respect they deserve. In the comments below, tell me about your own experiences with setting boundaries, requiring respect, and refusing to accept mistreatment from people who claim to love you. Remember, you are worth more than you've been accepting. You deserve better than you've been receiving. You have more power than you've been using. And sometimes, the most magical transformation of all is finally believing that truth enough to act on it with courage, strategy, and unwavering commitment to your own dignity. The magic was inside Margaret all along. She just had to decide to use it. And the same magic is inside you, waiting for the moment when you decide that respect isn't optional, dignity isn't negotiable, and love without consideration isn't love at all. Margaret's journey from abandoned mother to empowered woman proves that it's never too late to reclaim your power, command the respect you deserve, and show the world, and yourself, exactly what you're capable of when someone finally pushes you too far. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.